So this presentation will focus on segregation in DC and what role it plays in the current structure of the city. So an overview of this presentation is just the presentation will focus on how we'll focus on the history of segregation in DC and how it shaped the structure of today's city. It's basically it. So the history of segregation in DC after the Civil War, newly freed black people were trying to establish themselves in society, and Jim Crow laws were put in effect to bar black people from the same facilities as white people. Yeah, so Jim Crow laws segregated housing, recreational areas, restaurants, etc. The federal government was the primary enforcer of racial segregation in America. Public policy and programs were key components in urban renewal, which caused black families to be displaced from their homes and make it hard for black people to build generational wealth. The major developers of North Washington used racial deed covenants to exclude African Americans from much of the new housing they built. For example, Petworth, Brightwood, in the area just east of Carter Barron. Real estate textbooks promoted segregation, and so did the Washington Real Estate Board Code of Ethics. Newspaper advertisements often used coded language to describe housing for whites only, but sometimes sellers noted outright that subdivisions were restricted. Use of racial language in real estate ads remained legal until the passage of the 1968 Fair Housing Act through Washington papers ended the practice in 1960. So a prominent example of how public housing is used to segregate black people in DC is Berry Farms. In 1950s, federally funded slum clearance and urban renewal projects changed the face of the public housing in DC, displacement from those areas put tremendous pressure on public housing systems. By the early 1960s, the area around Berry Farm transformed into a low-income, almost entirely black occupied neighborhood. Berry Farm fell into significant despair when the city stopped providing basic maintenance, including replacing burnt-out streetlights in the entire section of Anacostia. Berry Farms has been the epicenter of protest against housing injustice for the black community. In 2014, Berry Farm dwelling had been demolished to make way for a mixed-use, mixed-income development. Redevelopment and gentrification are changing the character of this neighborhood, displacing longtime residents. This is an example of how gentrification, unequal living standards that contribute to the structure of DC today. So, because of this place being demolished, it's changed the demographic of the area, and also, who's living there, how are they functioning. And this is just an example of basically the injustices that the black community has faced in DC and how displacement affects them. Housing segregation. So housing segregation basically is a way to bar black people from living in certain areas that white people may have lived and building generational wealth. So restricted covenants were common devices to enforce housing segregation. A Spring Valley neighborhood in Washington, D.C., such covenants excluded any persons who were, Armenians, Jewish, Hebrews, Parisian, Syrian. The Federal Housing Administration and the GI Bill played a key role in housing segregation in D.C. between 1940s and 1960s, as loans went to white homeowners in all white neighborhoods, and the federal government refused to give loans to black residents. FHA housing basically was forced on Rock Creek Park and North Missouri Avenue. So we're going to get into the methods that were used to restrict black people. So one of the methods that used to restrict black people's access to housing was restricted covenants. Restricted covenants are privately enforced by a contractor who did not agree to rent or sell properties to black people or any other marginalized group. In Washington, D.C., in the Spring Valley neighborhood, covenants excluded any persons of Semitic race. So another example is zoning. Zoning is when certain areas are marked as undesirable using grading systems. The common denominator is if these undesired areas were black people's access to transportation. So the areas were undesirable because black people are based off black people's access to transportation. By the 1930s, the city's residential zones were applied throughout Washington, D.C. and the Northwest Quadrant. Restrictions on residential building type correlated to accessible streetcars and bus services, in turn determined what housing was. Another example is redlining. Redlining is done by the FHA, and it's made for non-white neighborhoods to obtain long-term mortgages. Washington, D.C. used a grading scale that used letters A through H, and you can see it in this picture here. A being the first grade and the highest grade, and H being the sixth grade or the lowest grade. In the 1930s, the entire L'Enfant City, and Georgetown were classified as F. Type H sub-areas included today is Ivy City, the Arboretum, Gateway, Fort Lincoln, Carver, Langston neighborhoods west of the Anacostia River, everything lying east of the river, and North Benning Road. So next, steering. The U.S. Supreme Court defines steering as a practice by which real estate brokers and agents preserve and encourage patterns of racial segregation in available housing by steering members of racial and ethnic groups to buildings occupied by a number of such racial or ethnic groups and away from buildings and neighborhoods inhabited primarily by members of other races and groups. Real estate board nonetheless saw a need for its own code and drawn up in 1922, amended in 1934 and 1947. By 1947, the all-white board had adopted language explicit in its racial exclusion. So next, steering. The U.S. Supreme Court defines steering as a practice by which real estate brokers and agents preserve and encourage patterns of racial segregation in available housing by steering members of racial and ethnic groups to buildings occupied by a number of such racial or ethnic groups and away from buildings and neighborhoods inhabited primarily by members of other races and groups. Real estate board nonetheless saw a need for its own code and drawn up in 1922, amended in 1934 and 1947. By 1947, the all-white board had adopted language explicit in its racial exclusion in that national code. So segregation education. Racial covenants and policies excluded black people from the same housing opportunities of white people, which led to disparities in education. Brown v. Board mandated the integration of public schools across the U.S., but it didn't rectify the racial tensions between black and white people. The Boiling v. Sharpay case in 1954 explores black students fighting for equal treatment. So during the Great Migration, it was sending many black people north, many to D.C. as they fled the racial terror in the South. In many overcrowded black schools, there were many overcrowded black schools because more black people were coming to D.C. And because there were so many black people in D.C., black schools became overcrowded. So black parents protested, which led to Boiling v. Sharpay. The case focused on 11 black students wanting to attend an all-white school in Washington, D.C. The Supreme Court ruled that the segregation of public school was unconstitutional, but as black people moved into the schools, a lot of white people moved out. So segregation in recreational places. Black children weren't allowed the same access to recreational spaces as white children, and this is not just black children, this is black families, because we know that recreational places benefit families, evoke camaraderie among neighbors, so it's a lot that goes into there. Because of public policy segregation and lack of community investment in black neighborhoods did not have the same facilities as white neighborhoods. An example of these disparities in Washington, D.C. is Anacostia Park. So basically with Anacostia Park, it was broken up into sections. The black area was Section C, which was a smaller size. It only had like half of the amenities as the white side, which was the D section. D section was where white people were able to, have recreational fun. Although the separate but equal doctrine was in place in the United States during this time, segregation policies its systematic practices ensure that true equality stayed out of reach for Black Americans. So even though these two places were separate, like I was saying, they were still unequal because Black people did not have the facilities that white people had in this park, and this just led to further segregation throughout Washington, D.C. Segregation is a product of public policy, restrictive covenants, white banks refusing to loan Black people money for housing, and having predatory loan practices. But all of this stuff, Black communities were curated through segregation or renewal. So how does this manifest in present-day Washington, D.C.? Currently, because of segregation policies, many Black people have a hard time establishing themselves financially without help from the government. Also, gentrification through the city is displacing residents by making housing and other facilities unaffordable. And because of, segregating groups of people and not allowing them to, come together and live together and build generational wealth, we have this separation of people, which then leads to gentrification of Black areas, which then leads to displacement of Black people and people of color. So in the early 2000s, under Mayor Anthony Williams, the city began to cater to high and middle income households to bring them back to DC. The city couldn't tax federal property or wealthy white people who fled to the suburbs, many of whom worked in the city and were commuting from the suburbs. The success of these policies, along with the national patterns of wealthy residents moving back into the city they have been, it meant that the cost of living in the city skyrocketed, which made it hard for Black people to live, or people of color or low-income people to live here. And although that may be true recently in 2019, the Bowser administration signed the housing framework for equality and growth to distribute affordable housing more equitably throughout the city. So it seems like, Mayor Williams contributed more to catering to the wealthy DC residents, which can be very dangerous as, low income residents aren't able to have the same access to things as wealthier residents. And then Mayor Bowser is trying to kind of shift the framework, overturn a lot of those things that have been happening, which is good because it helps and benefits the people who've been displaced, the Black people who've been displaced throughout the city. So this is just a visual representation of how the city is changing and how segregation is still manifesting itself in DC. So for this image, purple represents white segregation and red represents high POC segregation. Gray represents low and medium segregation, and blue represents racial integration. So this information is based off the Othering and Belonging Institute. So segregation, white segregation has fallen. The purple represents high white segregation in the area. You can see that there's high white segregation in Cleveland Park in 2010. But as we shift to 2019, there's less white segregation and there is more low to medium segregation in that area. To this day, the area still remains wealthy and predominantly white, but less than 2010. And based off this image, it is obviously less segregation, less white, predominantly white segregation. So just white people living there, and it's less of that type of segregation. Some of the most prominent changes to DC, the DC segregation pattern has happened in North and Central DC areas like Shaw and Logan Circle. They've become more racially integrated as the years have gone by. As you see in 2000, it's mostly red, so there's high POC segregation, so it's a huge concentration of just, Black people. They're kind of segregated from any other area. But now, if you look 2010, it becomes a little bit more integrated in a sense. That was what that blue kind of represents. And then low to medium segregation is the gray. And now if you look at 2019, there's not as much POC segregation. You see that it's mostly low segregation and a lot of integration in that area. So yeah. And then unlike the North Central region of DC, areas east of the Anacostia River have remained the same because back in the day, a lot of black people were displaced to east of the Anacostia River, and also they were segregated in that area. So we're not really seeing much change there. It's still a lot of POC segregation in that part of the city, and this is just a result of displacement of black people, and due to urban renewal, and again, like I said, just segregating people off and creating policies that don't allow black people to live in certain spaces. So to conclude, DC has a long history of segregation policies that affect black people. So to conclude, DC has a long history of segregation policies that affect black people to this day, similar to many other cities across the nation. Segregation, displacement, urban renewal make it hard for black communities to move forward with their lives and build wealth for themselves and their families. And DC is becoming more prominently white, as gentrification makes it hard for long-term residents to continue to live in DC, because as we discussed in class, when you have a group of people who can no longer afford living in an area because you're building new buildings and more expensive restaurants and more expensive clothing places, there's no room for them to live there, so they are then displaced, put out of their homes. Present day DC's segregation changes in a lot of ways, but in a lot of ways it's still the same as we discussed with Anacostia. It's basically the same way it was before, and the segregation doesn't just take a toll on the structures of DC, it also takes a toll on education, it takes a toll on income. A lot of people in DC, have money because of gentrification, so the city's changing. So a lot of the people who didn't have money, who used to live in DC, are then displaced. So we're seeing a lot of displacement throughout the city, and a lot of gentrification, and some areas that are still segregated to this day, and it's still hard for black people in the city to build wealth, to generational wealth, and to continue on with their lives and try to find spaces where they can live due to segregation, gentrification, urban renewal, and all the other things that shape a city. Thank you so much for your time, and please enjoy the rest of your day.